Welcome to our program. My name is Joseph Majkut. I'm the director of the Energy Security and Climate Change program here at CSIS. I'm really excited for the conversation today with three brilliant colleagues, all who have studied the connection of climate and trade. The reason why we're having this conversation today is this actually started in the hallway here at CSIS. We were trying to figure out, geez, this just feels like there's a lot that's going to happen this fall. The EU and the US are negotiating multiple trade arrangements for steel and aluminum, potentially for critical minerals. The European Union is standing up soft launching its carbon border adjustment program next month. And at the same moment, the EU is investigating a trade case on Chinese EVs and asking the question if subsidies in China are leading to, I think, what we would call excess capacity, but I'm not ever quite sure. So what we decided to do is on a Friday morning, get together, have a cup of coffee, and just try and unpack a little bit about what's going on. The three people that are joining me are my colleagues from CSIS, Emily Benson, who's one of our trade experts, and Ilaria Mazzocco, who's spent a lot of time in one of our China programs looking at economics and industrial policy for electric vehicles and other clean technologies. We're joined by Sagatom Saha, a colleague from the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Welcome, Sagatom, to CSIS this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off with an announcement that we saw this week. We knew that the US and the EU were going to have some sort of principal meeting on the sort of climate and trade nexus, especially on the global arrangement for sustainable steel and aluminum. Now it looks like that meeting is going to happen the third week of October here in Washington. Sagatom, Emily, can we start with you guys and just say, like, what do we expect to see? What are these principles even going to be talking about?
I can give it a first stab and maybe you expound. But I think there are like 3 central components, and they're related to two sources of tension at the intersection of climate and trade between the US and EU. And one is stemming from the Inflation Reduction Act. This goes primarily to the electric vehicles tax credit, where very complicated. There are a couple parts of the tax credit, but essentially there's a component tied to critical minerals tied from free trade agreement countries with the United States, of which the European Union is actually not one. Mm-hmm. IRA was passed a little over a year ago, and in that intervening time, we've seen a kind of loud, kind of uproarious kind of upbraiding from European leaders that they've been excluded from the IRA. And the Biden administration, to its credit, has done a lot to kind of negotiate and like loosely define under the contours of the IRA what a free trade agreement is. They've actually already reached an agreement with Japan, but not the European Union.
Right.
We could see that agreement emerge with the EU.
So let's take a pause there just for the moment. I mean, this Japanese deal, I've read it. Doesn't really say that much, right? Yeah. It seems like it doesn't change the status quo. It's just deciding we're going to not make trade in minerals further illiberal, and like that sort is meant from the administration standpoint to sort of allow the IRA to draw on a larger set of factories, facilities, a larger supply chain for EVs, right?
Yeah, basically. I think that does dramatically change the status quo. Maybe not the Japan deal in and of itself, and certainly not the EU deal. I can come back to that. But I think that essentially the administration is crafting a tool where they can have an FTA narrowly defined and then not have to go to Congress, not go to the Senate to ratify it.
Right.
And the reason why the Japan deal very well could matter is that the administration has also kind of loosely defined what a critical mineral is. It includes like the metal powders and cathodes and anodes. So that is also broader. And Japan doesn't really mine critical minerals, but they do create those things.
Right.
So that is helpful. The EU less so. So I'm less excited about kind of this component of what we might see in October. But Emily can talk about maybe the more exciting components where we have this global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, of which there are two components there, one on climate tariffs, which we probably won't see anything on, but steel excess capacity and aluminum excess capacity, which we might.
Yeah, I think, like you say, Joseph and Sagatom, there's just a lot going on. We passed the IRA last year. The carbon border adjustment mechanism has become law with an initial reporting requirement going into effect at the beginning of October. And then the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum has a deadline of October 31st. If Brussels and Washington cannot reach a consensus agreement by then, there's a chance, I think an unlikely one, that both sides revert to apply additional tariffs on various products across the Atlantic. Both parties have a very vested interest in avoiding the worst case scenario. The European Union does not want to have to tariff things like bourbon from Kentucky or blue jeans or
Which did happen.
which did happen previously. And so they're very vested in preventing that outcome from materializing. On the U.S. side, they are essentially trying to use the GASSA, as we call it on this side of the Atlantic. I'll note that the Europeans tend to call it the GSA, and the lack of an S in the European Union is sort of throwing shade at the Americans because they take out the sustainability reference. So for the Europeans, it's just a global steel arrangement. For the Americans, it's a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum. So already you can see we're kind of at an impasse because the Europeans are saying, well, this isn't really a good faith argument because your steel isn't that sustainable. So already some background difference in how we're approaching this arrangement. But for the Americans, they're looking at this and thinking, wow, what a great mechanism through which we can combat Chinese overcapacity of steel and aluminum. We can also reward the trade of decarbonized goods and avoid a reversion to additional tariffs with the European Union and reduce Trump tariffs with our closest ally. What that all means is that this is a really good first test case of the Sullivan Doctrine. Jake Sullivan said in an April speech, look, we're doing things differently. Trade from here on out will be different. And our penultimate example of how this will work is GASSA. Well, here we are. The principals are coming to Washington October 20th. I haven't talked to anyone that is 100% confident, yeah, they're going to release the deal October 21st or even November 1st. I think what will probably transpire is that we'll get a principled statement that hits the minimum threshold for averting a catastrophe, but at the same time, similar to the Japan deal that Sagatom was referencing, it will probably leave a little bit to be desired. So I'm curious to crack open the PDF when it drops, and maybe that's just me being a huge nerd, but we will have to see what's in it, and I think there will be plenty for our communities to digest.
Well, maybe I could ask you guys to call the ball a little bit since you've both been watching it relatively closely. Like, what is a good scenario, right? Like, what is and I'm sort of outside maybe the bounds of what is politically achievable, and I'd love your thoughts on where the breaks are. But like, what is the positive vision of a global steel and aluminum or global sustainable steel and aluminum deal between the EU and the U.S.? Like, if we could get over some of the hurdles, what would we actually want to see as like trading partners that want to see cleaner industrial production, want to protect that sort of like nascent industry, and want to have harmony between across the Atlantic?
I have some thoughts.
Let
that
it
could
rip.
probably take up like the next 35 minutes. But
We're here. Let me just note one moment for our online audience. If you're watching live, we should have the capacity to take questions through the question box, and I've got my little unit here, so we should be able to see those. Those can come in on a rolling basis, so please feel free, and we'll try to incorporate them into the conversation.
Yeah,
Sagatom,
I'll
give
try
us the
to
positive view.
give like an introductory entree into my view, and then maybe we can talk more about it. And I think I have similar views, at least Emily. But I think at the very least, we need some sort of interoperable system between the U.S. and EU on how to use climate tariffs, because, you know, like the CBAM, the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is already happening, and that will compel, and I think it's a good policy ultimately, but leaves some refinement to be desired. But CBAM will require the EU to either tariff countries like India, China, the United States, a bunch of countries that do not have a carbon tariff themselves domestically, internally, or less than the EU's, which is kind of floating, market determined at around $100 per ton. No country really has that. Right. Or it would require the countries to like themselves adopt that policy. And then the United States has these various other kind of proposals. The Biden administration's is GASSA, but there are Democratic versions and Republican versions in Congress about what we might do with a border carbon adjustment. And the longer we go down this road, and the more politically fraught it might get, and where if we don't have the collective market power of the US and EU and a kind of aligned vision where we have interoperable systems, trade kind of, in my mind, ceases to be a useful tool to kind of compel higher virtuous climate action, and then kind of maybe drags to like a least common denominator.
So can I like roughly map this and say like, these tools either are going to help in the climate process and be pretty open to low carbon trade, whatever that exactly means, or they're going to try to revert to sort of protectionism and frictional
Bourbon and blue
trade
jean
systems.
tariffs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one really good outcome would be for the European Union and United States to reach a mutual definition of what's a green commodity. That's really the baseline if we're looking at the future of climate and trade, is this ability to say, here's what constitutes green steel, or here's the amount of clean electricity that you have to procure in order to call it green aluminum. And that's pretty foundational. That's actually pretty hard because it gets into the weeds of electricity markets and energy procurement and shipping, and you can pretty quickly get lost in the details, but I think that's step one. And if they can reach a common definition, that really opens the door for others like Norway, which is not part of the European Union, Japan, the United Kingdom. Pretty quickly, you can see how this has the possibility of creating a new architecture that would look like a climate club.
Yeah.
Interesting. Go for it.
To add to that, I agree 100% with all of that. The EU probably also needs to create pathways for regulatory equivalency with the CBAM. And I think a climate club could also kind of work on what is common carbon accounting methodology, which sounds incredibly in the weeds, but quite important. Because we have different carbon prices for different things, whether social costs of carbon or different carbon price mechanisms, which can be determined by like an ETS or a trading scheme or like an actual price that floats or not. But all of this to say, like, California has a carbon system and the EU has a carbon system that will just judge the same ton of steel differently. And that's a bit of a problem. And the EU has moved first, but there's no reason they should or can define what the price is for the rest of the world.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. Do we make steel in California?
I don't know.
We might have been in the
I mean,
90s. I recently watched Terminator 2, and as they leave,
Great movie.
Yeah, but
One
as
of the
they
few, yeah.
as they leave LA, right in the final part of the movie, like they end up in a fight in a steel factory. And I was like, I don't actually think that those are in LA, but it's a good point because like one thing I've never understood. Sorry for the diversion. Is what does the U.S. ask under GASSA? Right, so like the EU's doing its thing, right? They have an ETS, and that is meant to govern the emissions from steel production, from aluminum, other things. Like they have a border adjustment, which is going to replace what had been a free allocation system. That's sort of cap and trade design issues, but basically it's there because they want to tighten their emissions standards going to 2030. And they want to sort of encourage other countries politically or economically to embrace carbon pricing or decarbonization somehow, right? We wrote a paper about that, and that's like, given their domestic policy, utterly defensible. What does the U.S. want out of this deal?
Well, this is where I get blacklisted from Washington.
So I didn't want to answer.
This is
It's okay. This is a cancel-free zone.
yeah, perfect. Glad it's live streamed. What's kind of a head scratcher to me, at least, is that the European Union has already poured enormous effort into figuring out what constitutes green steel and what constitutes green aluminum. They've already done years of homework. And so one could argue that the United States should go ahead and adopt that standard just to save us all time and bandwidth. But what's happened during the negotiations for GASSA is that the United States is saying, we will reduce tariffs on your goods coming into our country in exchange for relief under the CBAM. And that's sort of a red line for the European Union because their hands are statutorily tied. And if being constrained by your legislative branch sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what's happening with the IRA. The European Union is complaining about our package that was passed by the legislative branch and not the executive. And so they're both sort of talking past each other in a way because they're making a demand that's already gone into law in each jurisdiction. And so we're sort of at this impasse where it would be very viable for the United States to say, okay, we'll be a little bit flexible, we'll adopt your standard. However, that would contravene pretty much all foreign policy traditions of the United States, which is very reluctant to want to tie its hands to an international authority. And that gets into sovereignty issues, and that's not unusual for a country. But in this case, it's just so wonky, the carbon accounting weeds. And so we're going to have to figure out how we get to the next level of cooperation.
I think that's exactly right. Like, it is kind of incredible we're at this point where, like, measurement of embedded carbon is going to be very geopolitical, but that is the case. And I mean, it's more than just like an international authority, but it's another kind of, it's the European Union. It's like another country almost. So tying our standard to it, like the Brussels effect, effectively, we don't want to get too caught up in that. I think like the good faith additional argument beyond that is like a whole different worldview for how we should use carbon tariffs in the United States, which is like performance based. There's like pretty good work out there, and it's not true of every single good commodity, but it's true of steel. I think that we are actually cleaner on the average basis. Our steel is actually cleaner than the EU's, like a little bit so, but certainly than most of the world. So why does it matter whether we have a carbon price if we all agreed to tariff more carbon intensive steel than ours, and then kind of have a ratcheting standard so that we work towards some even better standard than where we are now.
Right.
And that's just very different than what CBAM is supposed to be.
Is there a debate? I mean, underlying the tension between the EU and the U.S. has to be that the EU has, whether or not its ETS will work to reduce emissions of steel production, it at least has a policy in place to do so, whereas the U.S. is ahead right now because of the kind of steel we make, right? Electric arc furnaces mostly making recycled steel or steel from recycled feedstocks. Like, do we have, is that part of the tension? Like, are we sort of seeing like national climate approaches to national climate policy differing between the EU and the US, and those just being like hard to harmonize?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this goes into a much broader discussion about the WTO. And historically, the WTO would play a role in opening a multilateral space for deeper cooperation, but the WTO is kind of slowing down. The U.S. is not reinvigorating it sufficiently so that it has a functioning dispute settlement mechanism. There are a lot of issues, and I think the failure of the WTO to adequately confront this nexus of climate and trade has resulted in individual blocs or countries pursuing these unilateral approaches.
Right.
And so absent some sort of forum for discussing all of these issues, countries are throwing up their hands and saying, well, we don't have an international way of adjudicating what is the right way to go about it. Therefore, we'll do what's viable through our own domestic political processes. And that's really gotten us to where we are now. And it's a cautionary tale about how to avoid these outcomes in the future where we're converging from the baseline.
Well, to me, a big question is like, as we, like we're going into COP this fall, and I believe the narrative that there is like increased climate ambition around the world, and that's good. But I'm wondering if that increased climate ambition is going to cause more trade friction over the next decade as countries try to vie for having parts of this new energy economy. They want to capture the supply chains and be part of the manufacturing story. And that brings us to Ilaria and Ilaria's work on EVs, because I want to stay on the EU for a minute. I think this trade case around Chinese EVs kind of so clearly demonstrates the different political challenges associated with an energy transition. As we talk a lot about critical minerals, but just like the manufacturing world has to change a lot. So, Ilaria, maybe you could kind of jump in and give us a picture of this paper you recently wrote on sort of Chinese EVs and how they look set to just kind of in a tidal wave spill across the whole world, and what countries are thinking about doing about that.
Yeah, and actually, before I even get to that, I was going to say this is what it's not frustrating, but always strikes me when there's conversations about Climate Club and GASSA and everything. It's like, who makes a lot of steel? It's China.
Right.
And when we have all these conversations, we're leaving out the biggest emitter. And often in Washington, the discourse is aimed at the purpose is to exclude China because the conversation is around partnerships and partner countries, allies, etc. But it does complicate, I think, things from a climate perspective, right? Where we should be really interested in lowering emissions in countries like China or India. Although I guess, if there were to be clearer standards, then that could be, potentially one could imagine those standards then being adopted globally. But yes, the EV part is, I think it's gotten a lot of attention. There's been a lot of news. I don't know if we want to talk about the CATL deal here in the U.S. as well, the affair as we called it. So what I wrote a paper recently on this. We looked at a little bit at data. My co-author was Gregor Sebastian from Merix. And what we found was that exports from China of electric vehicles have increased significantly in recent years. I remember thinking about writing this paper a year ago, and I was like, the data doesn't really show much.
Right.
I'm going to wait on this. And then this year, wow, what an increase. It's been really impressive. What is also impressive is it's not just Chinese brands, right? Chinese brands do very well, and I'm happy to talk about them. BYD is a very impressive company. But 40% of exports from China to the European Union of electric vehicles are Teslas this year. So I think that complicates the picture a little bit, and I think that's at the heart of the concerns in the European Union. They're looking around. The U.S. has tariffs on Chinese imports, automotive imports. It has the IRA, which has localization requirements. Even countries in the global South are introducing policies that are more aimed at localizing production. Even if you look at Southeast Asia or Brazil, for example. There's just there's competition to attract investment. And I think the European Union is feeling a little squeezed. And in addition to all that, there is the automotive industry is really important. It's a big employer. It's a big component of the manufacturing base in the European Union. And what their concern is in Brussels is that not only are you getting this competition from these new Chinese brands, which are taking up a bigger and bigger market share in China. So, China traditionally, the market has been dominated by non-Chinese companies. Western companies have done very well. Volkswagen has always done very well. But with the advance of electric vehicles, there is much more direct competition, and companies like Volkswagen are not doing so well. And so not only are these companies not doing very well in China, but they're starting to produce more in China, and they're not selling in China. And where are they going to be selling? Increasingly, it looks like the flow is going towards Europe, but also then those Chinese companies that are outcompeting them in China may be coming to Europe. So I think there's a big concern about where are European companies going, and where is European manufacturing going. And so I think that all flows into the big announcement that came a couple of weeks ago that von der Leyen made during the State of the Union, that they will be doing an investigation. Now, this is going to take a long time. We don't have the details. There recently, Dombrovskis, who oversees trade, seemed to indicate that Western companies will also be included in this investigation. So we'll see. As I said, that Western companies are big. European companies are a big part of this, and so we'll see. What that's going to put Tesla obviously in an awkward position, I think. But I think there's just a lot of details to be hashed out. But I think this is part of a broader European shifts on trade, where we're seeing a very strategic approach to this. The announcement was made right before Dombrovskis went to China, and then he went to China and he talked about openness to European investment in China, right? The discourse is not just about cars, it's about the broader trade deficit, 400 billion euros, right? A lot of concern. Infant formula came up, right? There's a lot of different sectors there. It's not just climate-related sectors, but it has a big implication for climate.
Interesting. And how much do you think there's a economic case versus this is trying to manage the politics of European automakers just getting absolutely shellacked in a competitive marketplace?
Yeah, look, there is an economic part of this, but in a way, I think the irony is that subsidies were really important in the initial launching of the industry, right? 10 years ago, subsidies were central, right? You wouldn't have the industry without subsidies. But now these companies are pretty competitive, right? BYD has a very vertically integrated model, so it can really gain much more competitive advantage because it produces its own battery, right? And that's a big part of the value add in an electric vehicle. A lot of these companies are very creative in how they're thinking about approaching consumers as well. They're prioritizing the software in ways that legacy car makers have struggled to do. And I think you just see that even with Tesla, right? It's not just a Chinese auto thing. So I think there's a complication where it's not just subsidies, and that makes it more complicated to come up with solutions, right? Because it is just subsidies and you put a tariff and that should solve it. But this has consistently been an issue with Chinese products where, with solar panels, it wasn't enough to put tariffs, right? And I think this is going to be a big challenge for electric vehicles. Well, you really need to probably there needs to be a better way of thinking about combining foreign direct investment from China, right? Getting a bit of that, technology and investment from China in Europe or potentially the United States, as well as maybe providing more incentives for European car makers to be a little more innovative, and probably also put more pressure on them to be more innovative.
Well, and you kind of have the same story that feels like it played out in the early 80s before any of us were really working. But Japanese automakers were seen as a huge threat by Western companies. There were tariffs and trade fights, and now like Honda, Toyota, they're all making cars here in the United States, and they sort of have a global manufacturing footprint. Can you imagine the same thing happening with Chinese EVs in Europe? And can we imagine the same thing happening with Chinese EVs in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in hearing the others' thoughts on this. I think it's it's a little complicated by the geopolitical dynamics, right? Certainly here in the U.S. I think also, the European Union doesn't quite have the same kind of instruments that the U.S. has in terms of there's no buy EU policy, right? So I think now we've seen a whole slew of new instruments that are being introduced in Europe, and we'll see how those work and how the effective they are, and maybe attracting more investment and providing incentives for keeping manufacturing, or maybe even attracting new manufacturing in Europe. I will say, there are a lot of battery manufacturing plants in Europe that are Chinese owned. It's Chinese companies investing in Europe. So we've seen that's completely different from the United States, right? So we've seen a lot more openness to that. So potentially, I think that is a model. But I think it is complicated by a lot of increasing geopolitical tensions with China and the concerns about security.
Right. Open question to colleagues.
I think one of the interesting trade contours is that the United States is in a slightly different position than the European Union right now because of the Trump tariffs. And this is a little uncomfortable for people who are in a freer trade corner of Washington. But if you look at the rules of origin tariff rate on USMCA autos, it's 2.5%. It's 25% if you include the Trump tariff, and so cars from China are subject to a 27.5% tariff.
Right.
What that means is that you can basically get a lower tariff rate if you move into USMCA countries. And BYD and Chinese competitors, I believe, are opening up shop in Mexico and then kind of circumventing the purpose of the Trump tariffs by relocating. And that says a couple of things, which is namely that FTAs work. There is real utility in having this agreement with Canada and Mexico because it increases trade and it puts additional investment on our border. And I think your point about in a generation, will we see opening plants here and additional investment? Yeah, I mean, it's sort of where the wind is headed. And I think it would be a major economic misstep to let geopolitics intervene to preclude additional investment. If you look at some of the very cool stuff that's happening in countries like Slovakia or Poland, they've been very open about investment. 3% of Polish exports are related to batteries, and that's something that could happen here. We just have to keep an open mind that things change, and we need to be open to foreign investment.
And then how should we think about that security question, right? So there is a geopolitical thing. Batteries are software driven, they have firmware, there's like all sorts of kind of security concerns that may arise. Sagatom?
It's a good question. I can tell you, what is a policy by which you operationalize that? And to your concrete question of, will there be, I think Mexico might be different than within the United States, within Michigan. Are there going to be Chinese company car factories in the United States? I don't see that happening in the kind of medium to short term. And this really, it's all geopolitical, and it really circles around how foreign entities of concern will be defined, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is kind of layered on top of the USMCA that Emily mentioned. And we're driving a lot of battery and EV manufacturing in the United States in the last year because of the IRA. That is the driving incentive to create some sort of step change. And there is a clause that has not been defined, what is foreign entities concerned, which is essentially to what level it would be Chinese, Russian, North Korean kind of participation in these deals, in this manufacturing. There is a chips and science definition that is 25% of any Chinese company. That would certainly be damaging to all of this and really preclude anything from happening with China to that level. We're really even seeing kind of the margin conversation of what is allowed, like far removed from that. And like, I don't know if you want to talk about Ford CATL, but that is like the battlefront of like, can you enter a partnership?
I mean,
with the
you
Chinese
both brought it
company?
up, so maybe let's hear it. Let's have it out. I mean, all these things to me are of a piece, right? It's like, what's the extent that we're willing to be engaged with China on technology that's completely necessary for energy transition, where there is a true technological lead in the Chinese firms have, and that stuff's potentially quite good for energy transition. It could be good for the American consumer, but there is like a long-term strategic concern. So maybe we can, I'm happy to touch on it for a few minutes because I think these are all of a piece.
Well, I'll let them touch on the details of cattle, in which I am not an expert. But I think it's interesting we've gotten this far in the conversation without bringing up the big buzzword, which is de-risking.
Yeah.
Right.
And
That's because I don't know what it means.
well, I'll help you out then. For me, de-risking is basically having a plan B. And we learned a lot of difficult lessons in the fallout of COVID, and then geopolitical concerns and exposure to government changes in foreign jurisdictions means you might not be able to get what you need. And so you need to take policies that build additional resiliency into your supply chains, which means finding alternative marketplaces. The United States has defined this as friendshoring, or identifying friendly countries that don't pose an imminent national security threat, where you can stand up an alternative supply that helps you ensure you can really get what you need. When the Biden administration first came into office, they immediately initiated this critical supply chain review, and they identified the 4 supply chains that they thought were absolutely necessary to maintain economic and national security for the United States. Those are batteries, critical minerals, semiconductors, and medical supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
And like Sagatom said, part of our effort to move supply chains is infusing additional capital into the United States, trying to incentivize a scaling up domestically. But what's happened is that we've realized we can't do all of that here. We really do need foreign partnerships. And so a year and a half, 2 years in, what we see is, well, we would really like close partners to scale up. We would like China to play less of a visible role in a given supply chain, and we'll give you a bonus if you build it in America. And it's, I think, to be determined what sorts of costs that will entail and whether or not it will succeed. My personal view is that with more time, it absolutely can succeed, but this administration may not have the time it needs to see the agenda through. And so we'll just have to see how things play out.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say,
largely
yeah,
agree.
time is absolutely, I think, the central piece of this, because also from a climate perspective, there's not that much time, right? We need the solar panels now, not in 10 years, which is potentially how long it might take for ramping up supply chains elsewhere. So I think that just complicates the dilemma for policymakers, right? Where on the one hand, it is absolutely crucial to secure these supply chains in ways that make them more resilient and avoid shocks, and also over reliance on a single country, right, which happens to be China. But on the other hand, it does, there's it's going to be costly, and that cost and that the time that will take to ramp up these supply chains could really slow down the transition, which is something a lot of people don't want to say, but essentially that's the real risk here.
The 2 things I would add is we have the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's like domestic reshoring, there's friendshoring, and then there's kind of like, my first order concern is like, even if you do both of those really well, I don't think you can fully decouple, and that's not the goal. But you can only de-risk so much from Chinese critical mineral supply chains and EV battery supply chains. I don't think you can do it all, even if you do those both really well. But then the difference between reshoring and friendshoring, like we have the Inflation Reduction Act. It's like getting massaged, but we have a really robust tool to like reshore quite a bit. We don't really have a really strong policy toolkit for that friendshoring component, and it's this variety of like new clubs and new components and really like imaginative reworking of foreign policy, which I think is good. But like the Development Finance Corporation, EXIM, U.S. Trade and Development Agency, State Department, through like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, like these can only do so much. And then you have like a state-directed kind of like Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which I think gets overblown quite a bit, but like that's the countervailing weight.
I mean, we've seen calls for like a Marshall Plan for clean energy. That to me is a little bit what you're describing, right? That was an active government effort to redevelop parts of Europe, and it looked like command and control for a little bit, right? But it really did have a like it was a foreign policy tool, right? It'd be really interesting to see if we're going to see that happen with regard to climate, because you can kind of feel the potential for that building.
Yeah, I think the difference will be what Congress can do. What we're seeing, to give the Biden administration as much credit as it deserves, is what they can do without a lot of new money.
Right.
And that's how we are where we are.
Yeah, having grand strategy rest on the shoulders of the DFC is probably not workable long term.
And DFC is up for reauthorization, and there's talks
Right.
about going from like $60 billion in capital to like $100 billion, but that's like, that only gets you so far.
Right. Ilaria?
Well, I was going to say the BRI, we're not going to see that much happening with the BRI. I mean, it's been really like declining. I think it actually also highlights how challenging it is to do this, right? I think there's been a lot of regret in China about these massive loans that weren't really thought out very completely, and like a lot of the projects are failing, and so I think there has been like structuring of the whole project, and I think we'll be seeing a lot less of those like big flashy projects in very, very risky countries. That said, we're going to continue to see Chinese companies, right? I think there's a lot of confusion between like, what actual companies are doing, and some of them are private, some of them are state-owned enterprises, but they're expanding rapidly, and then there's the sort of a big state sponsored project, which is the BRI. And I think part of this is something I keep bringing up, so I apologize if this is repetitive, but I don't think we've shied away from defining the role of Chinese companies when it comes to de-risking. And by what I mean by that is these companies are going abroad, building up supply chains in other countries. I see that as potentially a good thing, right? I mean, obviously, it depends on the company, depends on the sector, depends how it's being done. There's conditions, right? We obviously want to maintain good standards on human rights and environmental impact, etc. But I think theoretically, as we said before, right, if there is more foreign direct investment and there is, more of that capacity being built elsewhere, that's not a bad thing. That's probably a good thing that we should be welcoming, right? That's part of the challenge, right? We don't want everything concentrated in one country. But in many cases, the companies that have the technical know-how, that have the financing, have the willingness to do this are Chinese companies. And I don't think anybody really wants to say that, but it's part of this puzzle, and I think we need to think a lot harder about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It seems like we need some sort of it's like strategic ambiguity, right? It's like we should be welcoming of foreign direct investment or Chinese technology on the right terms. Figuring out what those terms are, I think, is like a question for analysts like us, because it's unprobed at this time.
Absolutely, and I think that's really complicated. I mean, I think this is actually goes beyond the climate issue, right? Yeah. I think just having a more a clearer framework for what is welcome and what is not, and what is risky and what is not, I think would be helpful for even U.S. companies or Western companies in general as they engage in these industry or with their partners or competitors. And then I think would be, to be perfectly honest, I think it's also something that these Chinese companies should know, right? If they shouldn't be investing in the U.S., then maybe it's like this is a good time to let them know, right? And because there are factories being built at this moment, right? There's the CATL, but there's also the Goshen factory in Michigan that, as far as I know, is still ongoing. I'll note on the Chinese EVs factories, Polestar, which is owned by a Chinese company, is reportedly going to be building a factory. I mean, they are relying on the Volvo factory right now, right? They're Volvo is also Chinese owned, and something many people don't forget. BYD has a factory in California. Unionized workforce, actually, kind of an interesting thing, but they build buses. They do not have access to federal funding. So, I mean, I think that was identified as a risk, and so that's. But they're there, right? They're still building buses, so that's sort of an interesting thing there.
Interesting. Sagatom, you brought up clubs, right? So maybe we can kind of dial back. There's a lot of stuff that's happening in October and November, and I think we're expect to see this FEOC designation. I'm guessing
end of year, hypothetically.
Yeah, my guess is like December 27th, but wide band of uncertainty. But maybe we can dial back a little bit to think about what is this? How do some of these challenges resolve over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years? right? Of like, how do we, like in your mind, I'd be interested to hear, and I know you've written quite a bit about it, like what constitutes a climate club? Because I think
a good
different
question.
people hear that word or that term and they think different things. Like Bill Nordhaus wrote the book on climate clubs, but like that's there's big carbon prices. There are large trade censures for countries that don't have those large carbon prices. That's not what we're going to see a lot evolve, at least at the beginning. So what do you think about when you think about building this sort of like new trade architecture from the ground up?
I think it goes back to what Emily said earlier, where the first order need for this is the fact that we probably won't see any immediate medium term or maybe even long term reform to the World Trade Organization, which would otherwise kind of be the body to tackle a lot of what a climate club would do. So I still believe that's like a worthwhile task and we should figure out what those changes are. But assuming we're not going to see that, that's what the need for the climate club is. And I think it tackles all of these issues that we've been exploring for the last 40 odd minutes of what is the appropriate use of subsidies and the kind of local content and localization within subsidies, because the IRA happened and there's no getting around it, and it has kind of induced the Europeans, others, to kind of do similar policy. And that's probably a good thing in the long run, but we want competition with kind of guardrails and constraints.
Right.
We're also going to see a lot, like CBAM hasn't even happened yet, and like we've had a lot of tension over it, and even the price itself won't go into effect until 2026. What is the appropriate use of like a carbon price for tariffs? And that doesn't mean every country arrives at the same number, because that would be very difficult. But what are the constraints by which you develop, and what is the methodology that is globally accepted? Like international standards are very political. Kind of other like green boxes of what are appropriate trade tools. How do we do supply chain coordination? I don't even know what the tools for that might be. And what are the things you're not going to do? Like on the developing country side, Ilaria mentioned this. Like Indonesia has banned export of unprocessed critical minerals, as has a swath of kind of sub-Saharan African countries, others in Southeast Asia. That is, as far as we have seen, like pretty effective for them. Like that has attracted refinery investment in Indonesia, but that also probably adds cost. So what is like the constraints of everyone just do what is in your own self-interest, but might each incrementally slow the energy transition to add up to a slower energy transition,
Right.
but like actually incentivize domestic action? Because the thing that I am seeing that I think we don't talk enough about is the Paris Agreement assumes that every like rising tide lifts all boats, every individual action is universally good. But now we're in a world with IRA and CBAM to some extent, where one country's action might actually like impair another country's ability to act on climate. So we need to kind of limit that and collectively increase ambition.
Yeah, I think if you can very broadly define a climate club, it's basically what Sagatom said, where we're living in this environment where everyone's acting in their own self-interest. The core purpose of a climate club is to make that not the reality, is to make sure that everyone is convening to act in each other's interest. And what that means very practically is adopting mechanisms to make it easier to buy and sell green goods and services. And whether or not that will involve subsidy reform, or, for example, making it easier to spend more on subsidies, or whether it will involve some sort of tariff reduction or a domestic price on carbon, that will all be part of the toolkit. But what we're lacking now is the infrastructure to talk about it across jurisdictions. Right. And I think Ilaria alluded to this earlier, but another uncomfortable truth is that this can't just be wealthy countries. We will have to have India on board. The United States is, I think, going to encounter a reality when, if they really want to pursue deeper decarbonization, they'll have to talk to China about it. We'll have to have Indonesia at the table. That is not politically viable right now. It's also too hard and too messy. You know, it's like having a dinner party. You can't have too many people over. It gets too wild, too chaotic. You can't do the seating chart. You have to start small. You have to figure out, okay, who can reach an agreement at the early stage, and then who can you invite over time to expand? And we're really at the foundational level of standing up that first interaction that will inform subsequent debates.
I've been at one of Emily's dinner parties, and she's the expert at this. So I also want to pull out one thing you mentioned that I always forget to mention. Extend the invite.
Chopped liver over here.
Yeah, you're next. You're next. A victim.
Reducing tariffs on clean energy technology, like they're actually quite high across the board. Like we have our solar thing with China, but like the EU does it. India has their own. Like this is like a bit of a problem that we don't really mention. We're talking about new tariffs, but there should also be a reduction element.
Well, that to me is like kind of the key, right? So GASSA or GSA is a good example of some sort of agreement, right? Here, like, it's going to be outside the WTO. There's more like small d democratic accountability to the trade deals that are being set up. Like, I sort of get it intellectually, but if you want to see those build to actually govern trade, like something has to happen. And so I feel two ways about it, because I'm also looking at, well, what's this principals meeting going to be about in October? And we're like, well, we're not really sure. They might make a determination about excess capacity out of China, but like this emissions thing, we haven't quite worked that out yet. And so at what point do these things really need to deliver like a change in how commerce happens, a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the further liberalization of green trade, so that we can feel like there's something to build upon here and it's not just an idea in a book?
Yeah, I mean, Ilaria mentioned it, but like it's probably yesterday. Like we're closer and closer to 2030, and every like emissions are still rising. But I think from a political standpoint, also yesterday, both the EU and the US are heading into elections, and there's like a pretty good non-zero. I don't take your own odds of which way those elections go, and I'll lurch rightward on kind of both sides of the Atlantic that preclude any sort of like positive consensus on this.
Got it. We could like sort of have to watch it develop over time.
Yeah. So the assumption that we get another bite at this apple, I assume what's going to happen is we're going to table this, and then we have to all go home and cater to our electorates. The ability to revisit this assumes the election goes one way here and one way there, and then both happen simultaneously.
Got it.
I'm not a betting man.
I think at the other end of the spectrum, though, you could see a reality where von der Leyen wins again, Biden wins again, and they've kicked the can down the road and they have to revisit it. But what we're seeing now, both in terms of CBAM implementation and this approaching October 31st deadline, is that dates and deadlines are actually really helpful. If you look at the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, it's sort of this bilateral dialogue that will presumably exist in perpetuity, although I think there's reason to suspect it'll be a little bit more limited. But it just sort of goes on, and it doesn't put negotiators under this pressure to resolve something by a certain date. And dates are very, very helpful in negotiations. They can be very sleepy. And then, as any USTR hardened negotiator will tell you, oh my gosh, the last 2 weeks is where all the work happens. And you hit the ground running and you actually produce something that has tangible benefits and concrete outcomes. And so I fear that even if we have the same political leadership on both sides of the Atlantic, that there's a way where this sort of falls off the radar. And so that's where we sort of have a call to arms of the think tank community, which is to make sure we don't lose this really amazing momentum that we have in the transatlantic trade and climate nexus right now.
Do you think that like the practice of trade negotiation actually needs to change, right? They've always been so closed. It's highly secretive. They're like college students. They wait until the last minute to write the whole thing. And there's like reasons for that, right? That prevents industry from getting in there and sort of creating opportunities for rent seeking and too much lobbying. But we also are dealing with these like sort of bigger political questions of like how much manufacturing do you want to have in Europe or the United States for various issues. Does our practice of how these things get negotiated need to change toward more openness?
Yeah, so that actually has changed in Europe following the deterioration of the TTIP, because TTIP basically was sunk by misconceptions about the substance of the agreement in Germany, which is interesting. And afterwards, the Europeans said, well, that was a complete mischaracterization of what was actually in the TTIP. And if we had publicized or made available some of the negotiating text or actually been more transparent from the get-go, TTIP probably would have gotten through, because a lot of these myths would have been debunked over time. So the European Union has actually kind of reconstituted the way that they communicate the negotiations of trade. That hasn't happened in the United States. And so if you look at some of the bilats with Europe and its allies, you can actually follow it fairly closely and you can get a good sense of what's under consideration. The United States, as you mentioned, just has a different political environment where I think that would open it up to a lot of intervening ideas from the private sector. And so I think for our side, that's probably not viable in the short term.
Well, we're kind of running up against our time here, so maybe we just do a quick round in a clockwise fashion. What's one thing you're watching in this space in the next few weeks, or one thing that anybody watching should expect to see from you? Ilaria?
Well, continue to watch the CATL affair and what happens with the anti-subsidy investigation in Europe. As I said, I think there's a lot of things we don't know yet. I will note, I mean, if they want to find subsidies in China, they will find subsidies in China. So I'm not, I don't think, but I do think this is a very political decision. And so I think that the politics around it are going to be really interesting to watch.
One thing from me. So I have a piece either coming out soon or actually today in Foreign Policy about what it would mean to take the Inflation Reduction Act abroad and make it actually do more for other countries and kind of do more of that friendshoring. And I guess what I'm watching is how CBAM, in a month, it's going to start administratively going into force. I'm curious how well that happens.
Right. Are people just going to be filing a form or will it have anything on it?
Yeah.
Advertisement for Sagatom. All of his pieces in foreign policy are very short and very readable, so I encourage you to click the link when you see it. Something I'm watching is the geopolitics of the transatlantic relationship with China as a backdrop. So the principals are meeting here October 20th. Valdis Dombrovskis will then go to China, but this comes at a time when Chancellor Scholz said yesterday, I believe, that he's suspicious about the European Union approach to potentially countervailing duties on EV imports into the European Union. And so we're already seeing this sort of fractured approach to how we confront China in the climate space, unclear how it'll work out, if the Americans will make demands of the European Union or vice versa. And so there's this sort of muddled future at this trilateral existence. And so we'll have to see what concrete outcomes the Transatlantic Alliance can deliver by the end of the year.
Super cool. For my own part, my program over the last couple months has been doing a ton of interviews with business leaders, policymakers, academics, sort of tracking the success of our onshoring and to some extent our friendshoring agenda. We're publishing a series, like a short podcast series. I think it's 6 or 7 episodes called New Shores. So I hope you guys give it a listen, and colleagues online will get the chance to do that too. It's a really interesting story. There's things that I think we should feel really positively about in the wake of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA. And there's clear and evident challenges to making the achieving its full vision. So I hope everybody gets a chance to listen to that. It's been a really interesting project. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we will see what happens over the next couple months. And I've had a lot of fun chatting, so hopefully we get the chance to do this again soon.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Joseph Majkut for the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program logging off. Thank you all for joining us.